I wanted to take a little extra time and talk about vitamin D out of our micronutrition lecture. So when we look at the micronutrients, we have the water-soluble and fat-soluble vitamins, and we have vitamin D, which is one of those fat-soluble. Now, vitamin D plays a double life. It's considered a vitamin, but it really is a hormone, and we could really talk about this more in the endocrine lecture than we do in nutrition, but it is labeled as a vitamin, and it's one of those nutrients that you don't necessarily want to, you really can't get from your diet and don't necessarily want to take in supplemental form. So when we look at sunlight, and I know it's weird that we're talking about light when we're talking about nutrients, but there's a spectrum of light that exists, and as we get into the narrower or more higher frequently wavelengths, we get into the ultraviolet light, and you got on the other end of the spectrum over here on the right side the infrared light, and then you have your visible light in between. We'll talk about the infrared light in terms of a healing mechanism, and we've also already talked about visible light in terms of the blue light spectrum over here on this side in terms of its effect on melatonin, another hormone. So this is now twice now that light is coming up with our play in hormonal function. And what we get from sunlight is the spectrum of visible, this prism, infrared, and this ultraviolet spectrum, UVA, UVB, and UVC. And we're going to be talking a lot about the differential between UVA and UVB. This is the spectrum of the wavelength that we see, the Roy G. Biv, the rainbow or the prism, with the red light having the higher frequency and or lower frequency, and this having the higher frequency, the shorter wavelength aspect. This suppresses melatonin. This does not affect your night vision, and we've had a whole lecture on that already. What we're talking about now is the ultraviolet light that's coming from the sun, the non-visible light that is usually associated with suntans, skin damage, and cancer, and also vitamin D production, specifically UVB. Now, in order to have this conversation, we need to appreciate that the sun is rotating around the Earth is rotating around the sun, and there's a seasonality to the distance that exists between our planet and the sun, which is providing this energy. We have the summer solstice and winter solstice, that this is the furthest we are from the sun, and then we have our equinoxes both in the spring and in the fall when we're closer to that. And why this is important is we have that tilt, right? We have this axis that we're sitting on, and we have our different poles, and we are warmer, closer, our surface is closer to the sun during the summer and further away that in the winter. Not that it's further, it's just that the surface is tilted, and that tilt, that angle, gives us the different degrees or the angle at which the sun is elevating in our horizon. And as you can see from this image here, that the sun has a higher arc, higher zenith in June, and a lower aspect, in this case January, but even lower in December. And when we look at this from an aspects of our days, we see that we have the summer solstice, which is the longest day of the year. We have more daylight. It's still 24 hours for the rotation, but of that 24 hours, we're getting more daylight, maybe 12 to 14 hours of daylight. And then in December 21st, which is coming up, that's our shortest day. Again, 24 hours in the full day, but the amount of daylight that we have. So we might only have like 6 or 8 hours of daylight. And what happens is, you can see here, appreciate that the angle of the sun is also different. So when we look at in June, in the longest day, our sun rays are almost perpendicular, right? They never are truly perpendicular unless you're right at the equator, but we're north of the 37th degree parallel, and so it's at that angle. And then when we look at our winter in December, the shortest day, they're almost horizontal. So they have more of a horizontal component than vertical, whereas our summer sun has more of a vertical component than horizontal. So when we look at the longest day, the shortest day, and then we'll look at the middays, the equinox, you can see that the sun angle is about 50 degrees roughly. And what we need in order for vitamin D production, particularly for UVB rays to penetrate through the atmosphere, is you need a sun angle about 45 degrees, meaning that depending upon when you're at in the season, if the sun is below 45 degrees, most of the UVB is being reflected off the atmosphere and not reaching the planet, the Earth, which also means not reaching your skin. UVA still comes through, but that's a different UV spectrum. Anything above 45 is going to be better, and if you can get pure 90, that's going to be spot on. You're going to have the highest amount of UVB rays coming down. We're having this lecture from Chicagoland area, and so we're north of the 37th parallel. We're even further, which means that we have at least 1 month out of the year where we have no UVB radiation hitting our surface or our area. In fact, we actually have 4 months out of the year, and as you can see from this map here, the sunshine calendar, this is looking at the probability of the UVB rays coming in. And if we look here, we're between the 37th and 50th parallel. We have the months of January, February, November, and December where there's no UVB radiation hitting. And so our time to capitalize on UVB radiation is between the months of March, and it's actually the end of March until the end of October. So if we look here at the vitamin D synthesis and the likelihood of it happening, it's virtually null and void in December, right? The shortest day of the year. And this actually continues into January. So December 21st on, after December 25th, the days start getting longer. Unless you're living in South Florida or Southern Texas, you're not really getting much vitamin D. It's not until March, and particularly the end of March, like the third week of March, March 21st, 22nd, at the equinox, where you actually start to get a decent amount of sun to start producing, or at least absorbing UVB radiation. And so even March, in our area, not so much. It's not really until April that you actually start to get that vitamin D synthesis. This continues on until June, the longest day at the peak at the summer equinox, and you see end of June, really June 21st, June 22nd, in that time frame, and you can see that carries over in July. And then August, and then we get into September and we start going the opposite direction. Third week of September, September 22nd, September 23rd. It's like our real last opportunity for sun absorption, UVB. And then we get into October, and then it's downhill from there again until December, and then the cycle takes over. I just want to point out that the flu season that hits us every year is between the months of October through March, and it's also the same time where we don't have the UVB perspective. And when we look at a lot of the communicable diseases, particularly the respiratory viruses, there's a strong correlation between your vitamin D levels and your susceptibility or the intensity of the illness that you get from that. So it's just interesting that our flu season, it's not that the flu comes out at hiding in October. The flu's around all the time. You can get the flu in the summer. It's just more likely in those months, particularly the winter because of the dry air and we're indoors. But it's also because of significant reduction in vitamin D. So again, we're above the 37th parallel. We need to make sure one of two things. During the months of March through October, you are banking as much vitamin D as possible. It's fat soluble, so you have the ability to store it. Unfortunately, that's not the case. We're spending a lot of time indoors. And through the months of November, December, January, and February, that's a time to take a vacation and go to the equator if you can, or you need to figure out ways of either supplementing or exposing yourself to artificial UVB light or something in that effect. When we look at the total solar opportunities that exist, as we said, June 21st is the longest day, December 21st is the shortest day, and again, the days aren't shorter in terms of still 24 hours. What we're talking about is the daylight being short or long. So there's a time aspect to this, and when we look at your the height of the sun in the summer, your shadow is going to be a lot shorter, and as you look in the winter, the shadow is going to be a lot longer, and everything in between. Again, the rays in June are more vertical than they are horizontal. In December, they're more horizontal than they are vertical, and in the equinoxes, they're at like that 50 degree, 47 degrees. So there's a seasonality that exists. Like there's a season clock when the sun's available. There's also a chronological or time aspect of when sun is available, and not necessarily when sun's available. I keep on saying sun. It's when you look at that sunlight of those light frequencies, how much of that's actually getting through the atmosphere and hitting the planet on the ground, thus your skin. And you were always getting UVA, but for UVB, the one that actually causes vitamin D production, there's a window for that. So we constrained it to the months of March to October, and actually end of March, beginning of October. And even when in those months, even in the peak of the day, June 21st, right, between 10 and 2 is going to be your best time for that because of the angle of the sun, and high noon is the optimal time, right? That's when it's near 90 degrees, not quite. And even though the sun's out, you could probably get some UVB exposure up until 4 o'clock. But if you can get some time at high noon or anytime between 10 and 2, that's great. And what's happening is when the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, there's different angles of inclination of what's happening here. So you're like 45 degrees around 10 o'clock, near 90 degrees at noon, and then 135 degrees at 2 o'clock, and then as the sun sets at the horizon, it's back to lower and basically back to zero until it comes around again for the next day. What's happening is, depending upon the angle of the sun, it's casting a different shadow. And so not that you need to get out and get an azimuth out and try to measure the angle of the sun and look at the sun and get blinded. all you got to do is look at the ground, and if your shadow is larger than you, like in this case here, the shadow is too long, that angle is less than 45 degrees and it is reflecting too much of the UVB rays, and you're really not getting UVB absorption. You're getting exposed to UVA radiation, but not UVB. And as that sun comes higher and higher during the day, or depending upon the season, that angle, it's going to cast a different angle and it's going to cast a different shadow. So the shorter the shadow, the more overhead the sun; the longer the shadow, the more at the horizon the sun is. And so you can see a very long shadow here. This is quite a bit longer than the height of the actual object, so we can assume that the sun is at a lower angle than 45 degrees. And here it's about 60 degrees. And then here is when we actually get to 45 degrees, we see that the length of the shadow is the same height of the tree. And now we're nowhere in that range that we're getting exposed to the appropriate UVB radiation. And as the sun gets higher in the day, it's going to get right up as near peak, and then as it goes the opposite direction, the shadows go from short then to long. So as I keep on alluding to, is that there's a certain amount of the UVB exposure, only so much of it's actually getting to the surface. Now, since UVA is a higher frequency, it's going to penetrate better through the cloud cover and through the aspect and through the ozone layer, and actually get down into the water and actually penetrate through the water itself and get to the deep sea levels. UVB is a little bit more sensitive and it's not getting through, and then UVC, its frequency is so off that it's not even making it through the ozone. So we really never exposed to UVC radiation, just the UVB and UVA. The UVA, UVB, UVC also has different effects on penetration within the skin. So the UVB just hits that outer surface, so the skin surface and the upper layers of the epidermis, whereas the UVA, it penetrates deep and gets into the dermis, almost down to the hypodermis. As we'll talk about in some of our other lectures, we'll see that visible light actually does penetrate even more, and the near infrared, particularly the red spectrums, that goes even deeper and can penetrate down in the dermis, even sometimes through the skin, and it's used as a therapeutic for tissue healing, inflammation, and pain management. So that's a whole physiological aspect of using light for that. But we are dealing with this UV spectrum, and this is what we're focused on, particularly the UVB. And when we look at the UVB, UVA, we usually are trying to protect ourselves from that because we're thought that it's cancerous. And these sun rays can be damaging. That's why sunblock's been such a big thing, and usually blocks more of the UVB, because the UVB have been more, you feel that more superficial, that's more evident right away, the damage is right away, you can tell. Whereas the UVA, they're deeper absorbed, and the damage isn't as evident. And back when they were doing research, they felt that the UVB were the ones we needed to block, even though it's only UVB radiation that starts the vitamin D production process. UVC and UVA do not do that. When we look at the how much the UV light hits the surface, even during cloudy days, you can still get a sunburn because UVA penetrates through the clouds. UVB is mostly reflected and absorbed, and UVC never reaches the surface of the Earth. So we look at UVB versus UVA, you can see the amount of penetration and the damage that occurs, and you can see the association. So the UVB usually creates the skin reddening because it's mostly superficial and absorbed there. And you can burn from this, but it's usually associated with like the basal cell carcinomas and the non-malignant type aspect. These are actually fairly common. It's thought that like 95% of the population has these at some point, and the likelihood of dying from these are very low if they're caught early enough. And when caught early enough, like you've caught it within the first 2 years or 3 years of having it. So if you have like an open sore that's not healing after 6 months, it's probably a squamous cell or a basal cell carcinoma. You get that cut off and it's gone. The ones that are the issue are the melanomas, like the malignant melanomas, and that's usually deeper in the dermis, and that's caused by the UVA. So we have this huge fear of the sun, and we stay inside, particularly when the sun's the hottest, which is between 10 and 2, and particularly at noon, and we try to stay indoors. That's the only time UVB radiation is available. UVA is available all the time, and it is true that too much exposure to UVA can cause damage, and that's true of anything. Too much water can cause damage. Too much exercise. It's the Goldilocks principle again of just right. The thing is that UVB has a protective effect against UVA, and so if you have appropriate amount of UVB and you're getting the saturation of that, UVA is not damaging. UVB is there's only so much you can tolerate, and then your body's saturated, and now it's a law of diminishing returns where your 10-20 minutes in the sun was beneficial, and just because 20 minutes was beneficial, 60 minutes, tripling the time, is actually detrimental. Right? You've gone beyond stimulation and gone annihilation. So we use sunblock and sunscreen, and the problem with sunscreen is that it blocks both UVA and UVB. There's really no sunscreen out there that blocks only UVA radiation. If it blocks UVA, it also blocks UVB. And so when you see here, ideally what you'd want to do is you want to minimize your UVA exposure, and you want to maximize your UVB exposure, because really the damage here, yeah, there's damage. Again, too much of a good thing is a bad thing, but these are okay to deal with. This is the stuff that you want to kind of be leery of. In the end, though, people have different skin types and different tolerances, and the goal is to again stimulate, not annihilate. And so everyone's going to be different in terms of what their tolerance is, and there's different ways of blocking the sun. Right? You can put a t-shirt on, you can put a hat on, you could use sunscreen, and the darker you are, the more resistant to UV you are, and the lighter you are, the more sensitive to UV are. And so we look at the human race, and there's a whole spectrum of from albino white to dark brown as you can get, and there's everything in between. And depending upon historically where your ancestors came from, were you more equatorial type lineage, or were you more from the poles? If you're more from the poles, you're going to tend to be lighter and fairer skin, and if you're more towards the equator, you're going to be darker skin. And depending upon how dark your skin is, and really this is driven by how much melanin you have, how much epidermal melanin, the more UV resistant or sensitive you are going to be. Unfortunately, the case is that the more often you burn, so over here on the left end of the spectrum, you have a higher risk of cancer, not because you are prone to cancer, it's just that you're not as tolerant of the sun. Right? Your ancestors came from an area of near the Arctic Circle, think of Canada, or northern United States, or northern European, and they only had sun for 4, 5, 6 months out of the year. It was a little colder, so they were more covered up. You move further south, like to Greece or Italy, and you have southern European. They're outside more, they're going to be darker, and you go even further south, and you get towards the equator, it's hot all the time, and there's never an opportunity where the sun's down. So you can see where the driving force, the environmental forces and stresses would drive the how much residual melanin that there is there. And so when you're over here on this spectrum here, you're more UV resistance, and you tend to tan versus sunburn. You poll most of these people here, and you ask them how many times they have sunburn in their life, they're going to be hard pressed to tell you when. These people here, they might have they sunburn maybe once or twice. Here, 10 minutes in the sun, and they're burning. So what that drives now is how much exposure you need in order for vitamin D production. Now also keep in mind that our bodies adapt, right? So in the winter you might be here, and in the summer you move there, right? Or here this is you in the winter, and then you're outside and you get really dark, right? There's a tendency to have a darkening of the skin, and that's an increase in epidermal melanin. So the more melanin you have, the darker you are, the more resistant to UV. So it's an adaptive process, and it's also a genetic process of how light you become, and the sun drives how dark you become. And you can kind of use this here to look at the tendency of the burning. So this is just another way of looking at the spectrum that we had. Again, greater skin cancer with the lighter skin, rarer skin cancer. Now, it doesn't mean that people that are dark can't burn. It just means that it takes a lot of radiation for that. Right? Whereas here, it doesn't take much to get the threshold, which also means that the amount of total sun you need to get to the optimal amount of vitamin D is different. So there's not a one cookie cutter approach for everybody. Here, for more fair skinned people, in the summer months, they only need 10 minutes in the sun, whereas someone that's darker needs almost an hour or more in the sun. We look at like medium, like Mediterranean, they need about half that time. So we start to look, it's very interesting when you look at like European, and we look at a lot of the health disparities that exist. Vitamin D is tied to many, like high blood pressure, cancer risk, so forth. When we look at the United States, and we look at the health discrepancies here between darker communities versus lighter communities, there's no doubt that there's some inequity that exists within financial and opportunities to get to hospital, but a big part of that can be tied to your vitamin D production. Someone that's fairer skin, Caucasian, they're able to get the vitamin D they need just from kind of walking outside and taking a 10-minute lunch break, whereas people that are darker, that are more from the equator, they're now further north at above that 37th degree parallel. They're going to need a significantly more amount of time, and in the winter, they're not getting it. They're not getting it all. How do you spend 300 minutes outside in the winter to get your sunlight, to get your vitamin D? That's a big aspect. And vitamin D, only within the last 10 years, has been on the radar for a association for this cancer and cardiovascular disease and longevity. And so it's fascinating to see. And again, this is a very easy explanation to understand the physiology. There's nothing genetically different. There is genetically, right? There's more melanin versus not. But just as much as getting more sun exposure to combat the vitamin D deficiency that exists. So when we look at vitamin D itself, I said that it's more of a hormone, and we looked at cholesterol as being the foundation for a lot of steroid or fat-based hormones. And your body takes cholesterol and it converts it to the 7-dehydrocholesterol, and all is different is it takes one of these hydrogens out and makes a double bond. So that's it. This is stored in the skin, and when the skin is exposed to UVB light and heat, I want to reiterate the heat part, this molecule unfolds and becomes the vitamin D3 precursor that then gets transferred to the kidneys to be produced into the hormone form that's going to activate and do the things that we want it to do. So you can see here the light, the UVB hits the skin. This is converted to the vitamin D3 that gets bounded in and sent to the kidneys, and ultimately the effect that it has is it increases calcium in the tissue and calcium availability for the calcium absorption. Fat soluble vitamins, this D and then E, K, and A, they are mineral directors. That's really what their functions are. And what's interesting about the fat solubles, they can be stored. So we can store vitamin A when we're actually in a crisis that we have too much vitamin A now, and vitamin D can also be stored. What happens is we think that we can get this from our food sources. We get this vitamin D from food, and unfortunately, for whatever reason, and this is not for whatever reason, this is how things happen, is that this light and UVB, we know that this reaction's happening. What we haven't tracked is there's probably a dozen or so other reactions that are occurring, and with the UVB added with the heat, when the heat gets too high, it starts to deactivate some of this aspect. So you start to create other metabolites that come along with this. When you take vitamin D3 and you take it orally, you're just getting vitamin D3, and you're not getting all of the other things that are coming along from this light exposure. And so what ends up happening is oral vitamin D doesn't have the same effect. It has the same effect as the light, so you're getting it, but there's a consequence that comes along with oral vitamin D that does not come along from light exposure. And what that is calcification. So vitamin D orally, it increases calcium in the tissue beyond what it normally would have done just from the UVB light exposure, and it robs it of potassium. And when you look at the inflammatory or the immune responses, the body's response to that is calcify. Let's calcify the heck out of it. It's like duct tape for a camper or a prepper. Like when we look at calcification, the body has, in this case, it sounds like what we're looking physiologically, that there's an abundance of vitamin D too much. It doesn't know how to process it. Whereas the vitamin D that's coming from the light is balanced. Once you hit your saturation level, it turns it off, and it has some biophysiological feedback mechanism. Now, what I want to share with you is that vitamin D is used as a rodenticide. They use it as a poison to kill rats. Now, they're giving a large dose, right? They're giving about 10 times, 100 times a dose. But the reason why the rats die is usually because of a heart attack. So they've gotten this, and it's the oral vitamin that's doing that. So they give the oral vitamin D. Within 1 or 2 days, the rats have a heart attack. That's it. So vitamin D is a poison. It's used to kill mammals. And vitamin D can also do that to humans, but we need a larger dose. But it does not happen from the sunlight that you get. Now, you can also get vitamin D from food. And from the food, it's vitamin D2. And this is what's added to dairy products. And this is what you get. And mushrooms are the biggest source of that. Some fish, you can get it from, particularly the livers, and that's usually because they're getting it from another plant source. They're storing it. So same thing like the omega-3, unless the fish are getting it wild in their diet. But it eventually came from UVB at some point. Just the plant stored it, and you eat it, and then hopefully you convert it down. But the best way of making sure that you have vitamin D levels is through your exposure to sunlight. And so this is where you're actually making the vitamin D3 plus all the unknown metabolites that are coming along with it. And the best way is getting your butt outside in the sun between the time of 10 and 12, or 10 and 2, and hopefully at 12. Bare skin, right? As much skin exposure as you can, and the darker you are, the longer you need to be out there, and the lighter you are, don't burn.